All right, guys, let's get started with day 3 of WebLab. First, let's hit the announcements for today. Remember, you have setup homework to do. This is MongoDB setup, and you need that to follow along for Thursday's lecture. Second, our milestone 0 is due tonight, end of the day, Eastern time. Remember, you need to register your team on our portal. You can find that at weblab.is/portal. And the actual assignment is to submit 10 ideas for your project, and we'll provide feedback for the top 3 ideas. We have our live stream where you can follow along, and you can also follow along on our Zoom, and the links are up there on the slides. Today we do have office hours. Again, it's 7 to 9 p.m., found in the Stata basement, 32082. And if you want to join in from remote, just hop on the Zoom and tell us on the queue if you're doing it remotely. And then our lecture videos and recordings from day 1 and day 2 are up. You can find them at weblab.is/lecture-videos. All right, so let's get into actual lecture now, and we're going to be picking up where we left off from Lifecycle and Hooks, I believe. So you can find the same lecture slides as yesterday, and I believe we're at slide 131. So we're just going to recap what we went over yesterday. I know it's kind of fast and kind of confusing, so let's just hit those concepts again. So we're going to be starting off with the document object model, or the DOM. Now, recall that the DOM is a model representing our HTML elements in a single file instead as a tree of objects. Now, this is important because this allows us to interact with both HTML and JavaScript. So it's important to understand this. And let's actually talk about what each of these words mean. So document, that just represents or means the entire web page or HTML file that we're working in. Object, each HTML element, instead of being HTML, we're now thinking of it as an object. So it's compatible with JavaScript. And M, the model, this tree diagram here allows you to understand the structure and content of the HTML page. So having an understanding of the DOM is important because then we get into the React virtual DOM. Now, the React virtual DOM is a JavaScript version of the real DOM. So we need to maintain this because it goes into our component lifecycle. So here are the 3 phases that we talked about yesterday, and the 3 phases of a component lifecycle. The first is mounting, the second is updating, and third is dismount. So what is the mounting phase? It's the process of adding a component to the DOM. It's the first time that a component is called, and when this happens, it's the initial addition to the DOM. And what specifically happens during this phase, what steps occur? So the first one is the trigger. Now recall that there are multiple kinds of trigger, but in the mounting phase specifically, it's just when the component is first called. And then second, it's a trigger for the render step. React, in the render step, executes the component function, calls all the JavaScript, runs all that code to create its virtual DOM. Then it moves on to the commit step. And I kind of want to clarify this particular step and the nuance in it. So what happens in the commit step is that React compares the differences between its current virtual DOM that it just rendered with the previous virtual DOM. And then it commits the changes that it finds to the real DOM. Now, the reason why it does this is because if you just find the changes, it's more efficient than completely updating and committing the whole DOM. So that's why instead it just finds what actually changed. That's what we actually care about. That's what we want to commit. Okay. All right, so that was the first phase. Let's move on to the next phase, the updating phase. Now, this one is real similar to the mounting phase. It also involves kind of the same steps, having the trigger, a render, and a commit. So updating is when a trigger causes a re-render. So this is after it's already initially rendered. So first, a trigger occurs, and we'll see what triggers there are later in a bit. Second, it does the same thing. It goes on to the render step. It executes all the code of the component function in JavaScript to render a virtual DOM. Then third, again, it compares the differences between this new DOM that it created with the previous virtual DOM, and then finds those differences, commits those differences to the actual DOM so we can actually see those rendered on our web page. So yeah, notice they're both very similar, these 2 phases. They involve the same steps. The only difference really is what kind of trigger is involved. So mount is just the initial component call. And then the update, these triggers might include state changes, prop changes, and if the ancestor component, say like the parent component or a component above that same level, re-renders. Okay, so that's the update phase. And lastly, we have the dismount phase. This one is the process or removing of a component from the DOM. So there's not much to say on that. It's just like when you click away from a web page or a website, you're no longer using or displaying that component, so you remove it from the DOM. Okay, again, little overview along with some visualization here. This is the first phase. See, we have this component tree, and we want to mount this new component A, highlighted or colored in green. And then we move on to the updating phase. Let's say the state in this A component changes, and you can kind of tell because it changes color here. And then third, you have the dismount phase where it's removed from the component tree. All right, any questions with that idea before we move on to hooks? Okay, remember we always have weblab.is/questions. That's a live document that staff will always have their eye on to answer any questions you guys might have in case you don't want to disrupt the actual lecture. Okay, let's recap React hooks real quick, and the main one that we learned, use effect. So use effect is important because if you remember our motivation for introducing it, it was because we couldn't exactly run commands or JavaScript code when React state actually updated. There were some weird nuances with the actual execution and the timing of things. So use effect allows us to react as soon as a specific variable changes. Now, you can review those slides if you want, but that's just the general high-level idea. So the actual syntax, we're also going to explore what it looks like in code, is generally this. It's a function you import from the React library, and you pass in a function as well as an optional dependency array. So this dependency array, whatever variable you pass into it, it's the variable that it reacts to. So yeah, it just runs the function every time that variable in the array changes. All right, so again, this is the same example we presented yesterday. In this case, it calls this function myFunction every time variable 1 or variable 2 changes, and also after the initial render. This one, it has nothing in its dependency array, so this means that it only calls it once when the component is first rendered or during the mount phase. And then this one, where we have no dependency array passed in, this means that it calls a function on the first render as well as any time the state changes. Okay. And this is what you're going to see when you find use effect in the code. You're going to have the function call and then this argument where we pass in a callback function. And then notice that we can actually return something in this callback function. And what that is you can think of it as kind of a cleanup function that calls every time that this component is dismounted. And then second argument is the dependency array. Okay, so yeah, what I just kind of said. All right, any questions there before we move on to new content today? All right, great. So I'm going to pass it off to Raymond for this part.
Okay, now we're going to do a walkthrough example of putting everything together. You guys can feel free to follow along on your computers, but it would just be us working on it together. So our goal here is to create this stopwatch example. So we have this button toggle clock, and then whenever that button is pressed, you mount your stopwatch component, and once that happens, you have a timer going. So let's first of all, let me stop sharing this window. I'm going to change to just desktop. Okay. So open up your terminal. So this command, use it in any of your directories, and it basically creates a new default React app. So So let's see here, and if we do npm create, how do you zoom in on here? Oh, there you go. And this takes the latest version of this tool called Vite. And whatever installations it asks you to install, you just proceed with it. And now we can define a project name. So I'll just call this our timer boy. We can lower the lights, maybe. And then within a framework, you would choose React. So if you guys want to work with a default React like setup, then you guys can definitely use this if you guys are starting off with your project. And we will use a JavaScript variant and just choose no for the roll down byte. Now we can install with npm and start now. And you will be able to see this already runs npm run dev for you. So if you guys just go to your local host, you will see that there is a default page here, and it has different things such as this button that increments when you press on it, increments count when you press on it. So this is just a basic React app. Is everyone following along well? So for your own projects, you can also just do this in order to have like a basic template to follow. Okay, let's now talk about the stopwatch example. So first, we are going to add a state, and we will call that the time. So const time set time and equals use state 0. We've been using this syntax for setting states throughout this time we've had here, so this should be pretty intuitive. Next, we have this function called set interval, and what it does is it runs a function inside defined there every interval. So here the interval will be 1000 milliseconds, which is just 1 second, and you're setting the time to the old time plus 1. And here you can see that we are actually calling old time and then making sure it becomes old time plus 1. And the reason why we do that is because of all the things we were talking about yesterday and today, in which you might have the state not updated to the most current value. So this ensures that you're using the latest state value. This happens because when you change a state, it only schedules an update, but you still need to finish running everything else in your code and then re-render it. So this is to prevent any loose ends for that. And you can see here the use effect is used because we want to make the stopwatch start every single time our stopwatch is first mounted. And because you can see the dependency array is empty, so that means it's just going to render on our initial render, which is when our stopwatch is first initially called. And then we also need to add a cleanup function. So that's what happens when you dismount the component. So after we press our button toggle clock again, it should disappear. So we just clear the interval, so we make sure the timer resets. And finally, we return that HTML of time. So set interval runs forever until clear interval, which resets it. And to interact with that, we have our parent component. And in the parent component, that's where we have to define a state called show stopwatch. So this is whether or not we are showing that stopwatch. So basically, if you press the button, you can go toggle between the stopwatch being open and closed. As you can see here, we are using the conditional rendering step that we talked about the other day, where we have this show stopwatch. It's this line right here. So if show stopwatch is true, we will show our stopwatch component, in which we're first initially mounting it, or we just show nothing. And take some time to look at the code, process what's going on here. We have a button, and that button on click will set the show stopwatch to whatever it wasn't. So if it was true, it would become false, and if it's false, it would become true. And that has a text toggle clock. So let's set that up over here in our code. So you have to open up this new React project that you just created. I think I put it in Lucas's here. So the timer boy, and just open this whole folder. And within this folder, we can see in source, we have the automatic stuff, so the index.css, main.js. And in the main, we call the app component. So we are going to create a new component. So let's add a folder called components. And inside the component, we are going to define our stopwatch component. So this one. So in here, in here, now we're gonna define our stopwatch component. So basically the same thing, or basically what we have up here. So this is creating a stopwatch component. And now within our stopwatch component, we are gonna have our first state. So that's the time. And use state. Start with our default value of 0. And now I'm like, oh wait, I have to actually import the useState hook from React. So make sure you're doing that. We'll be using useState and useEffect. So like that. And now we're gonna have our useEffect. So within the useEffect, we will have our first, the function. And in the function, we will define a new timer that sets an interval every 1,000 milliseconds. So every second, it will increment by 1. So set the time from our old time to our old time plus 1. And the reason why we do this is because if we just call old time plus 1, there's going to be some errors because it's not going to take the most recent value of the state. And this is the best way to make sure that you are using the most recent value of the state. So yeah, and then we have our interval, which is 1,000 milliseconds. Then we return what we have as our dismount, or what we run when we dismount. So we are going to reset the interval, and Jesus. There you go. Yeah. And remember, this section in here was our function, callback function, whenever we have anything changed in our dependency array right here. So in this dependency array, we have nothing else. So what that means is that we only run this in our initial render. And finally, we can return just the time as whatever the time is. So these brackets make it possible for you to call, like, here we have the JavaScript variable time. These should okay. And then the last thing is that we have to make sure that we export our component from this file. It's sorry. Okay. Now we want to make sure that our parent component, which is going to be an app, is going to call this stopwatch. So first thing we have to do is make sure that we are importing wait, Lucas, he's doing the okay, thank you. Okay, so import the stopwatch component. So import stopwatch from, okay, well, let's not cheat here, from the path in which the stopwatch component is. So you can do that by doing a period slash. So what this means is that you're just taking your current directory, and within that, you take your components folder and then stopwatch.jsx. So if you are trying to access a file from like outside of this current directory, you can call double period, which takes the parent directory. So we're going to be in source, and you can have, or sorry, you'll be outside of this source folder. So you'll be in the timer boy folder. So now you can call source slash components slash stopwatch.jsx. And that's just for example, but we can just do it like this as well. Okay. And now we want to have our state that either shows or doesn't show our stopwatch. So we have our state, and let's initialize it to false. Okay. And then within the return, that's what we're going to be displaying. We can add our button. And the button will display toggle clock as the text. And whenever the button is clicked, we are going to run this function. So set stopwatch, or sorry, set show stopwatch to whatever is not stopwatch. So stopwatch right now. And then finally, we actually need to use this state in order to have a situation in which you have show stopwatch. If show stopwatch is true, you will render our stopwatch component, else you would do the other one. So that conditional rendering statement can just be done with this. That's our Boolean value. And if that one is true, we have our stopwatch. And then if it's false, then we'll just have nothing. Okay. Now if you reload our localhost, you can see that we have a toggle clock button. And since our state is initialized as false, we are not going to show the stopwatch component until we press the toggle clock button. And once the toggle clock button is pressed, our time will start incrementing using our set interval function. And if you're curious that why there's like a specific CSS for that, you can see that through inspecting element, other browser. This one? Vivaldi? Wow. I've never heard of that. And yeah, you can, if you're in Google Chrome, which is what I use, there's just, if you right click, you can inspect it. And you can see that this you can go inside of the body and find where this toggle clock is. And since it's a button, there was another button that had count as 0 over here, and that's where the button appearance comes from. So we have it defined in somewhere else. But yeah, this is like a basic walkthrough of how you would create a blank React app, interact with maybe the inspect element, and how to use effect and hooks to make different parts of your web page dynamic. Yep. Thank you. Okay. Wrapping up, let's recap. So states and props, the main difference between them is that each component maintains their own states, and pass props between each other was more specifically from parent to child. So when a parent is defining the child component, it will add the prop into the declaration. So move the shared states of whatever is going on to parent components. So if you have two child components that both need the same state, it's better to move it to your parent component because you cannot share states across siblings. And then we've been talking about this component lifecycle of mount, update, and dismount, which consists of the trigger, so either the initial render or whenever other like state or prop changes, the render step, and then the commit step. And the reason why we use the use effect hook. So the reason why we use the use effect hook is so that whenever we have any variable such as a state that is changed within our dependency array, we can call this function. And we make sure that it doesn't run at every single re-render if we have a dependency array, because if it keeps running, it might have an issue. So if you're calling something external, you don't want it to be running every single time. You want it to run at a controlled rate. And we also talked about more React with conditional rendering and rendering multiple components using loop rendering, or in this case, we had the map function. And so hooks are really, really important because they let you interact with the React lifecycle. And if you need any more reference, you can go in react.dev/reference/react/hooks. And React has a lot of other hooks besides use state and use effect. So, yeah. And feel free to check out weblab.is/react guide. And if you guys want to check out advanced React lecture snippets, you can also check out this branch of Catbook React. So you have to go navigate back to the Catbook React folder. Yeah, and remember, feedback is really, really helpful. So hopefully you guys can give us some feedback.
All right, so I wanted to clarify one piece of syntax, because I feel like, I'm not sure if you covered it, like the functional setting of like inside of set time. So you know how usually we just pass in the updated state into the set time setter function. This is another way that React works. Instead, you can pass in a callback function, and it assumes that the variable that you're passing in, so here old time, is just the associated state. So somewhere underneath, React is keeping track of that set time is associated with the time state. So just a small like clarifier. Thank you guys.
All right, let's take a quick 4-minute break while we transition into the next workshop where you guys can actually get some practice with the concepts we've learned today, namely components, React, state, props, and the use effect hook.